There's an old saying in my country that says, raising other people's children is like pounding water in a mortar. This applies to our story today, if only partially, and we cannot generalize it, even nowadays. You see, when Catherine Parr moved her trunks into Hampton Court Palace in the summer of 1543, she was 31, twice widowed already, which in the 16th century made her practically a veteran of domestic survival. And now, well, now she was about to marry a man whose previous domestic arrangements usually ended with a scaffold or a cold, quiet dismissal to the countryside. King Henry VIII was old, and his temper, well, his temper was legendary for all the wrong reasons, but it wasn't just Henry she had to manage. No, that would have been too simple, wouldn't it? She was taking on 3 royal children from 3 different mothers, each of them carrying the heavy, awkward baggage of their mother's horrific downfalls. You've got Princess Mary, who was 27, devoutly Catholic, deeply scarred by how her mother, Catherine of Aragon, had been dumped and humiliated. She'd spent her youth being declared legitimate, then illegitimate, then forced to sign a document admitting her own parents' marriage was an incestuous sham, which must have done absolute wonders for her nerves. Mary was basically an adult who had spent years expecting to be executed or poisoned on her father's whim. Then you have Elizabeth, nearly 10 years old and sharp as a tack. She was living in hand-me-down dresses that were far too short for her because of extreme neglect and inadequate funding. All the while, she was fully aware that her mother, Anne Boleyn, had lost her head at the Tower, just a few miles from where she was reunited with her half-siblings. And finally, little Prince Edward, 6 years old, the golden boy, the long-awaited male heir whose birth killed his mother, Jane Seymour. 3 kids, 3 broken branches of a terrifying tree. Catherine looked at this fractured mess and didn't run away. Why? Maybe she was crazy. Or maybe, and I suspect this is closer to the truth, she was exceptionally clever and had a remarkably warm heart for a court that was essentially a den of viperous politicians. She started small. You don't rebuild a shattered family by making grand, sweeping speeches, do you? You do it with socks and books and shared meals. She knew Henry wanted a peaceful domestic life in his declining, painful years. He wanted to play the patriarch of a happy Tudor clan, even if he'd spent the last 15 years hacking that clan to pieces. So Catherine used that. She got permission to bring them together. Not all at once, that would have been a disaster, but gradually into a single unified household structure. The children never shared a single household, strictly owing to royal and health protocols. Edward had his own residence, often Hatfield or Ashridge, as did Elizabeth and Mary. Catherine Parr did not unite them in one home. Instead, she brought them together at the royal court during visits and events, overseeing their shared education and upbringing. What about her first private meeting with Mary? They were almost the same age. Catherine was actually a couple of years older than her new stepdaughter, which must have made for some exquisitely awkward small talk over embroidery. "Hello, I'm your new stepmother. I'm 3 years older than you, so please feel free to call me mother, or simply stare blankly into the distance while we sew." But Catherine didn't try to play the mother card with Mary. She played the friend card. She shared her love for high-end clothes, music, and Latin translation. They bought shoes together. Official Privy Purse accounts show them spending money on tiny domestic luxuries, dresses, gold thread, gifts for household servants. Also, Catherine took advantage of the connection between her mother, Maud Parr, and Mary's mother, who were close friends, to forge an easy relationship. And then there was Edward. Poor little Edward. He was being raised in a sterile, hyper-sanitized bubble at Hampton Court because Henry was utterly terrified of the boy catching a draft and dying. The kid wasn't allowed to play with normal children. Everything he touched was scrubbed down. Catherine stepped into that sterile nursery and brought a bit of actual human warmth into it. She didn't just check on his studies. She sat with him. She wrote him tiny, encouraging notes in Latin. She made sure his tutors weren't just drilling him like a soldier, but actually listening to him. Elizabeth was the trickiest one. Elizabeth had been banished to the periphery, labelled a bastard, forgotten whenever Henry got distracted by a new wife or a war with France. But Catherine saw something in that 10-year-old girl, something fierce. She brought Elizabeth back to court. She gave her a permanent spot near the Queen's apartments. She provided her access to top scholars like William Grindal and later Roger Ascham, who were full of these new, exciting Renaissance ideas. Catherine knew exactly what she was doing. She was making herself indispensable to the king by fixing the one thing his money and power couldn't buy: a home. But it wasn't just calculated political survival. If you read her letters, the actual surviving letters she wrote to these children, there's genuine tenderness there, real, unscripted affection. In a world of cold, transactional politics, she offered those 3 lonely royal kids something they hadn't experienced since they were infants, especially Edward. Safety, or at least the illusion of it. It wasn't going to be easy, though, keeping the peace between a staunch Catholic adult princess, a Protestant child prodigy, and an unspoiled boy prince while their terrifying father watched every move was like juggling loaded pistols. One slip, one wrong word about religion or treason, and the whole house of cards would come tumbling down. Catherine knew the stakes, and set to work establishing the rules of the new royal nursery. Gathering those 3 kids under one roof wasn't just a matter of sending out a few invitations and dusting off the spare bedrooms at Hampton Court. You have to understand how scattered they were, geographically and emotionally, floating around in separate country estates like forgotten ghosts of Henry's previous marriages. Mary was tucked away at Hunsdon or Havering, feeling ill half the time with those horrible stomach pains she suffered from her entire adult life, probably brought on by years of sheer terror under her father's thumb. Elizabeth was off at Hatfield growing up, while little Edward was practically kept under glass in a fortress-like nursery. Catherine started pulling strings, very gently, mind you. You couldn't just tell Henry, "Okay, I'm bringing your daughters back to court now." The old monster would have flared up instantly. She had to make him think it was all his brilliant idea. It worked, slowly. Catherine set up a very specific arrangement. She didn't dump them all in one wing like a modern boarding school. That would have caused absolute mayhem with their respective households, because each royal child had their own army of cooks, chaplains, ladies-in-waiting, and grooms of the stool. She focused on creating a central, shared sanctuary within her own queen's apartments, a neutral territory. Mary came in first. She was the hardest nut to crack in some ways. But Catherine was smart. She didn't demand reverence. She offered partnership. She bought Mary expensive presents. And they played cards together, gambling small sums of silver. Elizabeth was a completely different story. The kid was a sponge. She wanted knowledge, and she wanted it fast. Catherine noticed that Elizabeth's wardrobe was getting threadbare, literally. The poor girl had outgrown all her dresses, and her household budget had been cut so low by Henry's officials that her governess, Margaret Bryan, in 1536 had to write begging letters just to get the girl new petticoats. Catherine fixed that immediately. New clothes, new books, proper recognition. Edward was the prize, though, the golden calf. Henry watched Edward like a hawk watches a field mouse. If Edward sneezed, half the medical establishment of London was thrown into a panic. Catherine had to tread so carefully here. She couldn't look like she was interfering with the prince's official state education. Parr did not have the authority to relax or cancel these strict medical and security protocols imposed by the king to protect his only heir apparent. She brought human messiness into Edward's sterile life. She got him toys. Above all, she gave him a mother. There's this wonderful little detail from an ambassador's report where Edward writes to Catherine calling her his most dear mother. This was a kid who had never known a mother. Jane Seymour died 12 days after he was born. Catherine gave him a lap to sit on. Don't be fooled. Outside that room, much like how every story has a dark plot or a villain seeking to harm the heroes, the Conservative faction, led by Bishop Stephen Gardiner, a man who looked like he survived purely on vinegar and malice, was watching Catherine very closely. Gardiner hated the fact that Catherine was leaning toward the new religious ideas. He knew that if she influenced the royal children, the future of the English Church would swing permanently away from Rome. So while Catherine was teaching Elizabeth how to translate complex Latin prose, Gardiner was taking notes, looking for a slip-up, a bad phrasing in a prayer book, a sign of heresy. Catherine knew he was watching. She wasn't naive. You don't survive 2 dead husbands in 16th century England without learning how to read a room. She kept her domestic nursery rules strictly disciplined. No open arguments about theology in front of the servants. Polite, dignified behaviour at all times. High moral standards. She wanted the world to see a family. not a collection of rivals waiting for the old king to die so they could tear each other apart. Living in that house must have felt like living on the slope of an active volcano that occasionally spat out hot lava, just to remind everyone it was alive. Yet Catherine kept them together. She dragged them back to the dinner table day after day. She smoothed down Elizabeth's unruly red hair. She listened to Mary's complaints about her chronic headaches. And she checked Edward's Latin homework. She was building something that had never existed in the Tudor dynasty before, a shared childhood. Once she had all three of them under the same palace roofs, the real headache began: education. Because you couldn't just throw three royal kids into a room with a chalkboard and hope for the best, especially when their ages ranged from 6 to nearly 30, and their father was prone to executing people over theological fine print. Edward needed to be trained to rule an entire kingdom. Elizabeth needed to be brilliant enough to survive as a bastardized princess with zero political clout of her own. Mary? Well, Mary was already fully educated in the strict Spanish humanist tradition that her mother had imported decades earlier, so she was more of a peer than a student. Catherine took charge of the daily timetable. She was deeply influenced by the humanist movement, this massive intellectual shift blowing through Europe, emphasizing original classical texts, Greek, Hebrew, and critical thinking instead of just endless medieval rote learning. She hired John Check, brilliant chap from Cambridge, absolute genius at Greek, and Richard Cox for Edward. In the kids' surviving exercise books, honestly, his penmanship looks crisp, precise, an Italianate italic hand. I had to say this, or his father would have chopped my head off. Anyway, Elizabeth sat right alongside her little brother. That was Catherine's masterstroke. In Tudor society, girls, even royal girls, were usually educated separately, given a light dusting of French, some embroidery skill, a bit of lute playing, and then married off for diplomatic collateral. Catherine wasn't having it. She saw Elizabeth's terrifyingly sharp mind and matched her step for step with Edward's tutors. So, Elizabeth learned Greek grammar from William Grindal. Lessons were conducted individually or semi-jointly, depending on the presence of each of them at court. They didn't just read dry history books. They read rhetoric, how to construct a speech, how to persuade people without making them feel threatened. That specific skill probably saved Elizabeth's life 20 years later, when she was sitting on the throne dealing with a parliament full of stubborn old men trying to tell her who to marry. The routine wasn't all grueling intellectual labour, though. Catherine made sure there were afternoons set aside for music and physical discipline. Archery, horse riding in the park at Windsor or Hampton Court. Mary played the spinet exceptionally well. Elizabeth took up the lute. Edward was given small hunting bows tailored to his height. Stepmother personally commissioned Princess Mary to oversee and contribute to the translation of Erasmus's paraphrases from Latin into English, a monumental intellectual and linguistic project to which Mary devoted immense effort, fully supported by Catherine. There was a real method to this domestic madness. By creating a shared educational space, she was forcing Edward and Elizabeth to bond over their lessons. Edward adored Elizabeth. He called her his sweetest sister, or his sweet sister Temperance, because she was usually so composed and calm compared to the dramatic court around them. As I mentioned earlier, Edward was actually much closer to Elizabeth than to Mary during these nursery years, mostly because they shared tutors who held new, radical Protestant-leaning views. Mary's intellect, on the other hand, had been shaped in a completely different ideological era. Catherine tiptoed around those religious differences with immense skill during lesson hours. The texts chosen for translation were mostly classical Roman historians like Livy or Tacitus, or early Christian church fathers that both Catholics and Protestants could agree on without starting an argument over papal authority. She also heavily championed the use of English in their studies. While elite education still leaned almost exclusively on Latin and French for scholarly prestige, Catherine believed deeply in the power of the vernacular. She pushed for English to be treated not just as an everyday spoken tongue, but as a noble language worthy of high theology. She had Elizabeth translate Catherine's own devotional work, prayers or meditations, from English into French, Latin and Italian, which Elizabeth then presented to her father as a New Year's gift. Elizabeth also produced a beautiful handwritten translation of Marguerite of Navarre's poem Miroir de l'âme pécheresse, bound in embroidered blue silk, that she had stitched herself, and gave it to Catherine as a gift. That book still exists. You can see it. The stitching on the cover has intertwined initials KP for Catherine Parr. She was giving them a survival kit. The environment she built in that nursery wasn't just an academy, it was a sanctuary. Outside those doors, Henry was executing both sides, burning Protestants for denying transubstantiation and executing Catholics for denying that he was the boss of the church. Inside Catherine's rooms, though, there was a steady, quiet rhythm, the scratch of quill pens on parchment, the soft rustle of silk skirts, the sound of a boy prince practicing his Latin pronunciation while his stepmother sat nearby with her embroidery. Now, Princess Mary was a tough nut to crack. Seriously, she was adult when Catherine married her father, deeply set in her ways, carrying a massive weight of resentment from the decades of psychological torture her father had put her through after discarding her mother. The historical fiction always portrays Mary as this gloomy, miserable woman dressed in plain black velvet, staring out windows and brooding over heresy. In reality, her private accounts show she spent huge sums of money on bright red silks, expensive jewels, fine gold lace, and high-stakes card games. She loved gambling, loved it, lost quite a bit of cash playing cards with Catherine's ladies-in-waiting too. When Mary suffered from those terrible, agonizing migraines and stomach ailments, Catherine didn't just send a doctor, she personally visited her bedside. She brought scented waters, arranged for quiet rooms far from the noise of the main court, and sat with her. That kind of simple, personal warmth was something Mary hadn't experienced since her own mother died years before. It smoothed over the massive religious divide between them, at least for a while. Catherine organised the whole translation effort and asked Mary to translate Desiderius Erasmus's paraphrases on the New Testament into English. She specifically asked Mary to translate the section on the Gospel of John. Mary actually took it on, spending months translating Erasmus's Latin commentary into elegant English. When her health failed midway through, Catherine quietly arranged for Francis Mallet, Mary's Catholic chaplain, to finish the remaining chapters so Mary could still take public credit for this monumental work. Think about the subtlety of that move. Catherine was getting a staunchly Catholic princess to publish a scripture translation in the vernacular English language, a big step toward reformist ideals, and making Mary feel honoured and accomplished while doing it. It was brilliant diplomacy, wrapped in a domestic sewing circle. Henry, of course, was watching all of this. He must have liked seeing his daughter behaving herself and looking like a proper royal princess again. It made his court look stable to foreign ambassadors from Spain and France, who were constantly reporting on whether Mary was being mistreated. Mary's foreign cousins, like Emperor Charles V, were always monitoring her situation in England. If Mary was happy and well treated, Charles V was much less likely to cause trouble for Henry on the continent. Catherine used that to protect Mary's physical status at court. She made sure Mary was given her proper precedence right behind the Queen during public processions. The imperial ambassador, Eustace Chapuis, a man who usually hated most people at the English court and deeply despised Henry's second wife as an evil heretic, actually wrote quite favourably about wife number 6. He noted that the new queen was showing genuine kindness to Princess Mary, helping reconcile her with her father after years of bitter exile. Catherine was teaching Elizabeth how to navigate the deadly waters of the court, how to use modesty as a shield, and how to project authority without provoking the men around her. Predictably, Henry took note. He was a vain old monster, of course, but he was always willing to tolerate brilliance, provided it reflected well on his pedigree. The boy wasn't just a bookworm, though. Catherine pushed for a more rounded upbringing, making sure he wasn't turned into some weird, isolated academic hermit who didn't know how to ride a horse or talk to people. You know, Edward's surviving diary, which he kept when he was king, is one of the most chillingly cold documents you could ever read, completely detached from human emotion, even when detailing the execution of his own uncles, which makes you wonder if all this intense, high-pressure humanist schooling accidentally killed off his capacity for normal human empathy. Catherine tried to keep him human. That was her real fight. She brought other children into his orbit too, like the young noble Barnaby Fitzpatrick, who became Edward's close friend, or his whipping boy, as popular modern myth often claims. Though they were actually genuine friends, giving the prince at least a taste of normal childhood rivalry and companionship. The conservative faction at court hated how much control Catherine and her Protestant scholars had over the prince's mind. Stephen Gardiner and his allies saw what was happening. They knew that if Edward grew up steeped in this new radical theology, the old Catholic practices would be completely wiped out the moment Henry died. They were right, of course. Edward grew up to be a fierce religious radical. Catherine kept her balance on that knife edge. She made sure Edward's education looked impeccably orthodox and high-minded on the surface, emphasizing classical virtues, royal duty, and scripture, so Henry couldn't find any direct fault with it. Let's talk about the two ravens soaring in the Queen's sky. Stephen Gardiner and Lord Chancellor Thomas Wriothesley saw their golden opportunity. They were terrified of how much Protestant influence Catherine was pouring into young Edward and Elizabeth, so they decided to bring the Queen down for heresy. Plain and simple, they started with Anne Askew, a fierce, brilliant young evangelical woman who refused to recant her beliefs about the sacrament. Wriothesley went down to the Tower of London and racked Anne Askew himself, which was completely illegal, racking a gentlewoman, trying to get her to confess that Queen, along with her closest ladies, were secret heretics, funding forbidden books. Anne didn't break. She wouldn't give them Catherine's name, despite her joints being ripped completely out of socket. Gardiner pushed forward regardless. He convinced an exhausted, paranoid Henry to arrest her. Think about what that meant for the nursery. Elizabeth was 12. Edward was 8. They had already seen or know wives disappear or lose their heads. Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard. The kids weren't stupid. They must knew the sudden disappearance of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting meant the knife was out for Catherine. Catherine dodged the trap. You know the rest of the story. There's no need to finish it. They saw their stepmother walk out of the shadow of the executioner's block through pure, cold political intellect and total mastery of an old tyrant's psychology. It was a masterclass in domestic survival under a dictatorship. And I think Elizabeth Mind took meticulous notes on how Catherine used submission as a weapon, how she feigned weakness to achieve complete safety, a trick Elizabeth would use again and again during her own dangerous reign. And Catherine walked back into the nursery, her head firmly on her shoulders. Getting Henry to change the succession law was Catherine's biggest long-term political gamble. For over a decade, Mary and Elizabeth were legally declared bastards by their own father. Catherine wasn't satisfied with just having them live under her roof and sharing a dinner table. She wanted their royal bloodlines formally recognised by Parliament. She started to convince Henry in late 1543 and early 1544. She kept dropping subtle hints about dynastic stability, like saying, what if something happens to young Edward? If Edward died without heirs, the throne would be up for grabs. Civil war would break out between rival noble families like the Howards and the Seymours, and everything Henry had built would go up in flames. The Third Succession Act. This act did not restore their legitimacy, but allowed them to inherit the throne under certain condition. Edward see his father one last time in January 10th. Henry finally breathed his last in the early hours of January 28th, 1547. When Edward Seymour finally broke the news to the two children together in the Great Hall at Enfield, both Edward and Elizabeth burst into uncontrollable wild sobbing. They clung to each other so tightly, crying for hours. They were grieving the father who had terrified the world, but to them, he was still just their father. With Henry safely 6 feet under at Windsor, you'd think Catherine Parr could finally relax, put her feet up, and enjoy being a ridiculously rich widow with no terrifying old husband to manage. Not a chance. Things got weird, fast. Within just a couple of months, barely time for the black mourning velvet to get dusty, she went and secretly married Thomas Seymour, Lord High Admiral Seymour, Edward's ambitious, charismatic uncle. Catherine was pregnant for the very first time in her life. She moved out to Sudeley Castle to have the baby. She had a little girl, Mary Seymour. It should have been a happy ending, I suppose, but Tudor childbirth was a death sentence half the time. Catherine Parr died on September 5th, 1548, barely 6 days after giving birth. So, When you look back at that wild, bloody Tudor landscape, you have to ask yourself what actually survived after Catherine's brief, calm stint as stepmother. Henry's grand biological dynasty didn't last 6 decades after his death. None of those 3 kids had children of their own. The whole Tudor line burned out like a cheap candle in a damp draught. Yet the intellectual and personal mark she left on those 3 royal children was massive, utterly massive. Look at Edward first, poor little Edward. He took the Protestant education Catherine had fostered for him and ran completely wild with it during his brief 6-year reign. He tore down altars, melted down church gold, stripped whitewash off chapel walls, and pushed the Book of Common Prayer on a country that wasn't entirely ready for it. He ruled like a teenage zealot. When he died at 15 from a gruesome pulmonary infection, he tried to rewrite his father's Succession Act entirely to keep his Catholic sister Mary off the throne, undoubtedly egged on by his chief advisor, the first Duke of Northumberland. He bypassed Mary, bypassed Elizabeth, and handed the crown to Lady Jane Grey, who, funny enough, had been living in Catherine Parr's household at Sudeley Castle when Catherine died. Jane Grey lasted 9 days on the throne before Mary marched on London with an army. Mary took the crown through sheer grit and ancestral pride. When Mary became queen, she brought back the Latin Mass, aligned England with Catholic Spain, married Philip II, and burned nearly 300 Protestant heretics at the stake. Then came Elizabeth, the ultimate survivor. Elizabeth took Catherine's lesson book and turned it into a 44-year golden age. Everything Elizabeth did as queen, her religious settlement, her incredible speeches, her terrifying ability to manipulate the men on her Privy Council, had Catherine Parr written all over it. When viewed through Catherine Parr's life after the death of King Henry VIII, this proverb holds tragic truth. Despite spending years reuniting, protecting and educating Henry's children, her efforts crumbled into broken ties, boundary violations. Catherine had been Mary's closest ally at court, reinstating her into the succession, sharing music and tending to her illness. Yet, after Henry VIII died, that bond shattered almost instantly. Catherine secretly married Thomas Seymour barely a few months after Henry's death, without royal or council approval. Mary's reaction? Fiercely Catholic and intensely devoted to her father's memory, Mary viewed this hasty match as a gross insult to her late father. Although her stepmother played a major role in repairing her relationship with her father, the outcome, deepening religious divides and personal indignation, caused Mary to cold-shoulder Catherine completely, bringing an affectionate relationship to an icy end. This was the most painful hit to Catherine's domestic refuge, a true instance of pounding water in a mortar. Catherine had rescued Elizabeth from political exile, given her top scholars. Everything fell apart. Soon, Catherine's new husband, Thomas Seymour, began making highly inappropriate flirtatious intrusions into Elizabeth's bedchamber. Whether out of denial or a desperate attempt to manage her husband, Catherine initially joined in some of the bizarre horseplay, at one point holding Elizabeth while Seymour cut her morning gown into pieces. Eventually, a pregnant and deeply distressed Catherine caught them in an embrace and realized the horrific political danger. She was forced to send Elizabeth away to protect her stepdaughter's reputation and her own head. Though they continued exchanging affectionate letters, Catherine would never see Elizabeth in person again. With Edward, the proverb fails, because her investment in the boy prince proved a genuine success. When Catherine married Edward's maternal uncle, the 9-year-old king felt bypassed and manipulated by his uncle for political influence. Edward quickly forgave Catherine, granting his royal blessing to the marriage due to his deep childhood affection for his most dear mother. When Catherine died, young Edward was devastated. Her intellectual and religious influence remained with him until his death. What about her funeral? Not one of Henry's 3 children bothered to show up. I don't care about the reasons or royal protocol. They should have been there, above all Edward. Your father tore an entire church in 2 just to get a divorce. Surely you could have defied tradition for the woman who raised you. Instead, they dumped the duty of chief mourner onto a little girl, Jane Grey. Thanks for watching.